Darkness. Silence. The faint hiss of wind through trees that have seen centuries of pain. Then, a voice low, deliberate, echoing through the ruins of a plantation. Behind the plantation gates stood more than fields and crops. There were secrets buried in silence, unspeakable acts of control that turned human lives into tools of power. The image widens, cracked walls, old portraits, a faint candle flickering beside a rusted chain. The air feels heavy, as though the land itself remembers. The narrator continues, slower now, each word pulling us deeper. What if the real story of slavery isn't about cotton and chains, but about the hidden corruption that no one dared to write down? A door creaks open. Dust floats in a single beam of light. Somewhere in the distance, a whisper fades, a woman's voice saying, "Don't speak of it." The camera glides over the desolate remains of the American South, where wealth once shone like gold and cruelty hid beneath manners and lace. In the 1700s and 1800s, these were worlds of hierarchy, grand houses built on stolen breath. The masters called it civilization, but it was an empire of domination, disguised as order. Each morning, the fields awoke to the sounds of chains and orders. Each night, the same air thickened with the kind of silence only terror can teach. Power ruled everything here, power that decided who could love, who could speak, who could live. Inside the mansions, chandeliers glittered over marble floors while the enslaved moved in shadows, forbidden to be seen except in service. It was a world of appearances, the narrator says softly, wealth and civility on the surface, violence and violation beneath. The hypocrisy was complete. The same hands that prayed over supper held the whip. The same lips that recited scripture justified cruelty with verses. In that contradiction between supposed holiness and absolute control, power became something darker. It became hunger. At night, when the world grew quiet, you could hear the breath of the enslaved inside cabins too small to stand in, and the soft laughter of masters upstairs, living in their illusion of order. In that silence, the voice continues, power became the most dangerous form of hunger. The plantation was a kingdom, and its ruler, usually a white man, believed himself chosen, ordained, and untouchable. The law reinforced that delusion. The system of slavery was not only physical, it was psychological engineering. It taught generations that cruelty was normal and submission was virtue. Families were broken apart as easily as crops were harvested. Mothers torn from children, husbands from wives, all to remind them that they were not human in the eyes of those who claimed to own them. Control seeped into every corner, education forbidden, speech monitored, hope punished. To defy was to disappear. To obey was to survive. And still, there were sparks of defiance, tiny, unrecorded. Moments when a glance, a whispered name, or a secret prayer became rebellion. But rebellion came at a cost. Every act of resistance was met with pain designed not just to punish, but to erase. Fear became the silent overseer, doing the work even when the whip slept. When you own a person's body, the narrator murmurs, you begin to believe you own their soul. That belief turned ordinary people into monsters of control. As the sun sets over the fields, the story darkens further. What happened inside the homes, the narrator warns, was even more disturbing. The grand houses that symbolized refinement were built on filth. Behind the curtains, in rooms no one was allowed to enter, power was exercised in its most corrupt form. The enslaved were forced not only to serve but to be silent witnesses to acts that blurred every boundary between domination and desire. For some enslavers, cruelty became ritual and unspoken routine. The audience feels the air shift. The walls of history begin to close in. Inside these secret spaces, power meant permission. Permission to take, to humiliate, to erase. The enslaved could not refuse, could not run, could not speak. Even their silence was owned. For them, the night was not a time for rest, but for waiting, waiting for footsteps, for a call, for what might follow. For the enslaved, the voice says, now breaking with sorrow, even silence was survival. To speak meant death or worse. Imagine standing in that world, the glow of candlelight on polished wood, the faint smell of perfume mixed with sweat, the ticking of a clock marking the seconds between fear and pain. Outside, cicadas sang. Inside, the walls absorbed cries that no one else would ever hear. These weren't isolated evils, they were part of the system itself, a pattern of power that defined life on the plantation. As dawn breaks again, the cycle resets. The enslaved rise before the sun, carrying the weight of another day, while their masters sleep peacefully, convinced of their righteousness. And still, the whispers remain the echoes of what happened in the dark. The voice of the narrator returns, steady but heavy. They built an empire on control, but no empire built on silence can hide forever. The fields stretch endlessly toward the horizon, green and golden, covering graves that were never marked. In the distance, the camera lingers on a single, weathered door. It creaks open, as though the house itself is ready to confess. Inside those walls, truth twisted itself into survival. Every enslaved man and woman learned to read the moods of their masters, to predict when the night would turn dangerous. It wasn't only the whip they feared, it was the quiet summons, the gentle voice that hid filth behind civility. The plantation was a stage where violence wore perfume. The enslaved were forced to play roles, to smile, to pretend, to exist as living evidence of someone else's power. The white master's home, polished and holy in daylight, became a theater of cruelty by night. This was the hidden abuse of power, not recorded in ledgers, not carved into law, but embedded in the breath of the enslaved. Power, the narrator says softly, when unchecked, becomes obsession. An obsession, when fed by ownership, becomes something far more monstrous. Many enslavers justified their actions as natural rights. Some convinced themselves that these acts of domination were affection. Others didn't bother with excuses, they simply believed they could. No law stood in their way. Slave narratives later hinted at what could never be said aloud. Words like favored, trusted, or close to the master's family often masked stories of coercion. The enslaved lived double lives, one in public, one behind doors. To the world, they were silent. Inside, they were survivors of an unending nightmare. Imagine a woman standing in the corner of a candlelit room, her hands trembling as she waits for the master to call her name. Imagine her child sleeping nearby, unaware that survival in this world often meant surrendering to horror. Every morning after, life went on as if nothing happened. The field hands worked, the house slaves prepared breakfast, and the master's wife sat at the table in silence, pretending not to know. Some mistresses turned their anger on the enslaved women, punishing them for crimes they never chose. In this twisted triangle, everyone was trapped by the disease of power. There was no justice, the narrator continues, voice low, deliberate. Only hierarchy. And at the top of that hierarchy sat men who believed themselves gods. The impact on victims ran deeper than pain, it rewired the soul. To live under constant threat meant living in fragments, never whole. The enslaved learned to split their minds, to hide thoughts, to protect the small spark of humanity that the system tried to extinguish. The sided bring, scars were not always visible, but they shaped generations. Fear became inherited, passed like blood. A woman who had been assaulted might teach her daughter silence, not strength, because silence kept you alive. The trauma stretched far beyond the plantations. Even after emancipation, the victims carried invisible wounds. They walked through new towns, free in name but haunted in spirit. Some could not speak of what had happened, others tried and were silenced again by disbelief. How do you heal? The narrator asks, from wounds no one was allowed to see. The question lingers, unanswered, like smoke from an old fire. But the truth never stays buried forever. After the Civil War, fragments began to surface. Former slaves told their stories in letters, interviews, and memoirs. Some spoke plainly. Others hinted, too ashamed or afraid to say the words outright. Historians reading between the lines found the pattern not rare, not accidental, but systemic. The private diaries of white masters revealed contradictions so filthy, so hypocritical, they shattered the myth of Southern gentility. One man wrote of praying for his soul after weakness, then repeated the act the next night. Another recorded the birth of a child he refused to acknowledge as his child born into bondage. For generations, society refused to confront it. History textbooks spoke of labor systems, economic dependence, Southern tradition, but not rape, not violation, not the unspeakable. The past was edited for comfort. History cleaned its hands, the voice whispers, but the blood never truly washed away. The modern eye looks back and asks, how could they? But the deeper truth is more disturbing. They didn't see it as wrong. Power had blinded them completely. The consequences never disappeared. They lived on in the bodies and bloodlines of millions. Modern DNA studies reveal traces of European ancestry in African American families. living proof of what the archives tried to hide. Every statistic tells a story of control disguised as heritage. The walls may have fallen, the narrator says, but the shadows inside them never left. In today's world, the struggle over memory continues. Some schools still soften the story. Some call it heritage. Films and novels often romanticize the plantation as a place of beauty, erasing the screams buried beneath the magnolia trees. But new voices refuse to let that silence return. Historians, filmmakers, and educators now force the light into those dark corners. Each documentary, each testimony, tears away the lie that slavery was just an economic institution. It was psychological warfare. It was domination dressed as order. What happens to a society, the narrator asks, that builds its comfort on another's suffering? The question hangs over everything in monuments, in old money, in family names passed down from those who once claimed ownership of lives. The answer is visible in the world we still live in: inequality, trauma, and unspoken guilt. The final moments slow. A field at sunset, wind brushing through tall grass, where once people labored, cried, and died. These were not just acts of history, the voice says. They were acts of humanity at its lowest and courage at its highest. Those who survived passed down something stronger than pain: memory. Even silence can carry truth when the world refuses to listen.